That just shows you how quickly she was working towards this marriage, that she had already decided to plan her honeymoon before the engagement.
Joni Lamb's emotional breakdown on live TV has left viewers speechless. After Joyce Meyer's shocking confession rocked Daystar, the tension was palpable. What was said? How did it shatter the calm of Daystar's powerful leadership? You won't believe what Joni's reaction reveals about the future of this once unstoppable network. Stay tuned for jaw-dropping revelations that no one saw coming. Watch as Daystar's foundation trembles and Joni's emotions explode on live television. It was supposed to be just another calm, routine broadcast. The Daystar team had prepped, the cameras were rolling, and the audience settled in for what they expected to be a regular show. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. The studio, filled with the familiar hum of lights and cameras, suddenly went still. Joni Lamb, the face of Daystar, was sitting next to Joyce Meyer, a longtime friend and respected figure in the Christian community. What came next sent shockwaves through everyone present. Joyce Meyer, known for her impactful sermons and leadership in Christian media, took a breath and dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. She began speaking directly to the camera, her voice steady but filled with weight. In a few powerful sentences, she expressed deep concerns about the direction Daystar was headed under Joni Lamb's leadership. Joyce's words were blunt and to the point. She believed the network had lost touch with the humility and purpose that Marcus Lamb, Joni's late husband, had instilled in it. Instead of being a place of genuine faith, it had become more about control, image, and power. At first, the shock was palpable. Joni's confident smile faded as she tried to maintain composure, but it was clear that Joyce's words hit her hard. The cameras kept rolling, but behind the scenes, the tension was building. The two women had been allies, partners in faith and ministry for years. To hear Joyce voice such public disappointment was nothing short of a betrayal to Joni, who had built Daystar with Marcus from the ground up. It felt like a punch to the gut, one that no one in the studio, not even Joni, was prepared for. Outside the studio, news of Joyce Meyer's comments spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with reactions, and the Christian community was divided. Some supported Joyce, claiming she was speaking the truth that many had been too afraid to address. Others rushed to Joni's defense, accusing Joyce of publicly tearing down another woman of faith. What had started as a simple revelation soon turned into a media storm, with YouTube clips of the broadcast racking up millions of views and news outlets running stories about the fallout. For the Daystar team, the atmosphere quickly shifted from one of cooperation to one of confusion and fear. People began whispering in hallways, unsure of how to process what had just happened. Joni, who had been a pillar of strength and faith for so long, now found herself questioning her next steps. The foundation she had worked so hard to build was now under attack by someone she had considered a close friend. It was impossible to ignore the gravity of Joyce's words. What had once been a stable and unified ministry was now in turmoil, its future uncertain. The revelation wasn't just about leadership, it was about the very heart of Daystar. The network had built its reputation on faith, humility, and a commitment to spreading the gospel. But now, Joyce's words seemed to suggest that those values had been compromised. As the public reacted and the staff members tried to figure out what was going on, it became clear that Daystar would never be the same again. What started as a moment of shock turned into a full-scale crisis, one that no one saw coming but would change everything about the ministry and its leadership. The storm had been building quietly for months, but the fallout from that fateful broadcast sent waves through the Lamb family that no one could have predicted. It was more than just a clash between two powerful women. It was a family torn apart, caught in the crossfire of power struggles, unspoken expectations, and a legacy that seemed to unravel before their eyes. Joni Lamb had been there from the beginning. She had stood side by side with her late husband Marcus, helping him build Daystar from the ground up. Together, they had created a platform that touched millions, spreading a message of faith, hope, and love. But when Marcus passed away, the foundation of Daystar and the Lamb family itself began to tremble. The world assumed that Jonathan Lamb, Marcus's son, would naturally step into his father's shoes. After all, he had been groomed for this role. He knew the ins and outs of the ministry, and for years it seemed like the baton would pass to him seamlessly. But Joni had other plans. From the outside, everything seemed to be unfolding as expected. She took the reins temporarily, as any widow would, keeping the ministry moving forward while the family figured out what would come next. What no one realized was that Joni had no intention of stepping aside. Slowly but surely, she began to consolidate her power, making key decisions without Jonathan's input. What had once been a joint leadership was now becoming her vision alone. To Jonathan, it felt like a betrayal. He had spent years working alongside his father, learning how to lead the ministry and carry it into the future. He believed that his father's legacy was clear. He was the one who was meant to lead Daystar. But as Joni started to take more control, Jonathan's role began to shrink. He found himself excluded from meetings, decisions being made behind closed doors, and his voice ignored. The tension began to grow. Jonathan wasn't just losing his position in the ministry, he was losing his family. The dynamics had shifted, and with the shift came a growing sense of isolation. Joni wasn't just taking control of Daystar, she was reshaping their family's future without consulting him. It was painful to watch, and more painful to live through. As the power struggle deepened, Joni made a decision that would change everything. She married Dr. Doug Weiss, a well-known Christian counselor. This only complicated matters further. Doug's influence grew quickly, and soon he was at the center of everything. While some saw him as a stabilizing force, others felt that his presence was a symbol of the growing divide within the family. It wasn't just Joni leading the charge anymore. Now it was Joni and Doug. Jonathan, once the heir apparent, found himself increasingly sidelined. The final straw came when Joni made the difficult decision to fire Jonathan from Daystar. She released a public statement citing performance issues and his refusal to follow a performance improvement plan. But to Jonathan, it was much more than that. His departure wasn't about his performance. It was about a family fracture that had been building for years. To Joni, it was a painful but necessary step to protect the ministry. But to Jonathan, it felt like a final rejection from the woman who had once been his mother, his mentor, and his partner. The decision to fire Jonathan wasn't just a blow to him, it sent shockwaves through Daystar. Staff members who had once worked closely with Jonathan were now faced with the uncomfortable reality of choosing sides. Some were loyal to Joni, while others sided with Jonathan. The once warm and collaborative atmosphere at Daystar began to deteriorate, replaced by tension, fear, and division. Conversations were hushed in hallways, and people started watching what they said. The freedom and openness that Daystar had once fostered were slipping away, replaced by a corporate-like atmosphere. To Joni, this was a necessary sacrifice. She had to protect Marcus's legacy, she believed, and ensure Daystar's future. But to Jonathan, and to many others, it felt like the heart of the ministry was being lost in the process. Daystar had always been more than just a network. It was a family. But now, that family was splintering. The public feud became unavoidable. Jonathan started speaking out, criticizing his mother's leadership and the direction Daystar was heading. He described a culture of control, where loyalty to Joni mattered more than the ministry's mission. For some, his words confirmed their suspicions. Daystar was no longer the humble ministry it once was. It was becoming something else entirely. Others, however, defended Joni, arguing that she was doing what was necessary to keep the ministry alive in the face of difficult circumstances. Behind closed doors, the tension was even worse. Joni's leadership, once a source of unity, now felt like a power grab to many. Staff members who had been there from the beginning found themselves at odds with each other, unsure of where to stand. Joni and Doug's growing influence left many feeling excluded, as though they had no place in the ministry anymore. The more Joni pushed forward with her vision, the more divided Daystar became. Even as Joni tried to hold everything together, the cracks in the foundation grew wider. The network that had once been a beacon of faith now seemed like a shell of its former self. The changes in programming, the increasing focus on Joni and her inner circle, and the exclusion of voices from the past made many wonder if Daystar would ever return to the family-oriented ministry it once was. As the public battles continued, the Lamb family's personal struggles were laid bare for the world to see. The question that lingered in the air was whether Daystar could survive this fracture, whether it could rebuild trust and unity after everything that had happened. But more than that, it was a question of what kind of family they wanted to be. Could they heal the wounds of betrayal, loss, and power struggles, or had the damage gone too deep? The battle for control over Daystar had not only torn apart a family, but had also left the network at a crossroads. It was no longer just about leadership. It was about the very essence of what Daystar stood for. The Lamb family had built this ministry on faith, love, and unity. But now, it seemed like those values were slipping through their fingers. As the cameras kept rolling and the world watched, the true cost of power and ego became painfully clear. In the end, it was a family torn apart by its own ambitions, and the future of Daystar remained uncertain, left to pick up the pieces of what was once a shining example of faith in action. The changes inside Daystar were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but over time, they grew more obvious, and they became impossible to ignore. The network that had once felt like a family ministry, a place of warmth and unity, started to feel cold and distant. Staff members who had been there since the early days of Daystar began to notice the shift. They couldn't put their finger on it at first, but the atmosphere was changing. The laughter that once echoed through the halls started to fade. The camaraderie that had defined Daystar, where everyone worked together toward a common goal, seemed to disappear. It all began when Joni Lamb, widow of Marcus Lamb and co-founder of Daystar, started taking more control of the network's operations. After Marcus's sudden death, everyone expected Joni to step in temporarily, just long enough for the family to decide what would come next. After all, Marcus had always been the face of Daystar, the voice, the heart. He was the one who had brought the vision to life. So naturally, his family would carry that torch forward. Jonathan Lamb, Marcus's son, seemed like the logical choice to take over. He had grown up within the ministry, working alongside his father for years, learning the ins and outs of the business. It seemed like a given that Jonathan would step into the role of president, as Marcus had always intended. But what people didn't expect was how quickly Joni began to assert her authority. At first, it wasn't overt. She didn't suddenly demand control. Instead, it was more like a gradual shift. Joni started making more decisions, handling the day-to-day operations of the ministry without consulting Jonathan. Her quiet authority grew stronger, and soon, it was clear that she wasn't planning on stepping aside. The more she took charge, the more Jonathan's role diminished. Meetings were held without him. Important decisions were made without his input. Slowly but surely, Joni had taken over the leadership of Daystar, and Jonathan found himself left out in the cold. This shift wasn't just about business. It was about a family dynamic being redefined. For Jonathan, it was a painful process. His father had always been there, guiding him, teaching him how to lead. Jonathan had spent years preparing for the role he believed he was destined for. But now, with Joni's increased control, it felt like his father's legacy was slipping away. And it wasn't just the ministry that was changing, it was the Lamb family itself. Jonathan's relationship with his mother became strained as she pushed forward with her vision. He felt betrayed, like his mother was rewriting the plans Marcus had set in place. The ministry that his father had built seemed to be moving in a direction he didn't recognize. As Joni grew more entrenched in her leadership, she made another change that added fuel to the fire. She married Dr. Doug Weiss, a well-known Christian counselor. Doug's influence began to permeate Daystar's operations. His presence was felt everywhere. His ideas, his voice, and his direction began to shape the ministry. To some, Doug was a steadying influence, someone who could help Joni navigate the difficult transition. But to others, his growing power felt like an intrusion. Doug's involvement added an extra layer of tension within the family, and many felt that the ministry was losing its family-oriented touch. Daystar had always been about faith and unity, but now it seemed more like a corporate empire with Joni and Doug at the top. Jonathan, who had once been at the center of Daystar's leadership, found himself pushed further and further out. His concerns about the direction of the ministry fell on deaf ears. When he tried to voice his frustrations, he was accused of being bitter and jealous. To some, it seemed like Jonathan's only problem was that he wasn't in control. But for Jonathan, it wasn't about control. It was about preserving the heart of Daystar. He believed the ministry was losing its soul, and he was deeply concerned that his mother was more focused on power and image than on the mission Marcus had built Daystar to fulfill. The tension between Joni and Jonathan grew, and it didn't take long for it to spill out into the public eye. Jonathan was officially removed from his leadership position, with Joni citing performance issues and his refusal to follow a performance improvement plan. The decision was framed as a business one, but for many, it felt deeply personal. Jonathan's supporters couldn't understand why Joni had made such a drastic move. It wasn't just about a job, it was about a family being torn apart. The fallout from Jonathan's removal was swift and painful. Inside Daystar, the atmosphere shifted from one of collaboration and unity to one of division and distrust. Staff members who had worked closely with Jonathan found themselves caught in the middle. Some remained loyal to Joni, supporting her vision for Daystar. Others, however, felt that Jonathan had been unfairly treated. The once close-knit family of employees found themselves divided, unsure of who to trust. The culture at Daystar, once so open and welcoming, became more controlled. Meetings became more rigid. Conversations became quieter. People began to fear speaking their minds, worried that saying the wrong thing could cost them their jobs. The once dynamic and creative energy that fueled the ministry seemed to have been replaced by a cold, corporate atmosphere. As the changes continued, Daystar's programming began to reflect the shift in leadership. What had once been a diverse network, showcasing a variety of ministries and voices, started to focus more on Joni and her message. Shows that once celebrated different aspects of the Christian faith were replaced with segments that aligned more closely with Joni's personal vision. The network that had once been a place where different voices could come together to spread the gospel now felt like a reflection of one person's agenda. For many longtime viewers, this shift was jarring. They had watched Daystar grow from a humble ministry to a powerhouse of Christian broadcasting, and they had trusted the network to stay true to its roots. But now, they saw a ministry that seemed to be losing its way. The once warm, welcoming atmosphere was gone, replaced by a more polished, more controlled image. Viewers began to ask questions. Was this still the Daystar they had known and loved, or had it become something else entirely? Inside Daystar, the staff continued to work, but the spirit of the place was changing. The air was thick with tension. Staff members whispered about the changes, some defending Joni, others quietly supporting Jonathan. But no one felt free to speak openly. The trust that had once been the backbone of Daystar's success was eroding, and with it, the culture of unity and faith that had defined the ministry. Joni, for her part, tried to maintain control. She worked harder than ever to reassure partners, donors, and viewers that Daystar was still on track, that its mission hadn't changed. She spoke of restoration, of God using brokenness for something greater. But even as she spoke these words, the cracks in the foundation were clear. The network that Marcus Lamb had built was no longer the same. The family that had worked side by side to create something powerful was fractured, and no amount of polished speeches could erase that reality. Doug Weiss's increasing presence at Daystar only added to the sense of confusion and division. His influence grew, but not everyone was on board with his role in the ministry's future. Some saw him as a stabilizing force, someone who could help Joni navigate the difficult transition. Others saw him as another power player, a symbol of the shift from family ministry to corporate empire. Through all of this, Jonathan remained largely silent. He had been removed from the ministry he had once helped lead, and his absence spoke volumes. For some, his silence was a sign of his hurt and disappointment. For others, it was a sign that he was choosing to protect what was left of his family, choosing peace over the chaos that had consumed Daystar. As the changes continued to unfold, the question remained, could Daystar recover from this? Could it rebuild trust and unity after everything that had happened? Or had the damage been done? The future of Daystar was uncertain, and with every decision Joni made, the walls between the family grew higher. Daystar, once a beacon of faith, now found itself at a crossroads, torn between the legacy of Marcus Lamb and the new direction Joni was forging. Whether the ministry would find its way back to its roots or continue down a path of division and control remained to be seen. But one thing was clear, Daystar would never be the same again. The battle for Daystar's future had been quietly brewing for months, but when it finally surfaced, it was impossible to ignore. It all began with Marcus Lamb's sudden passing. To the outside world, Daystar was a shining example of Christian broadcasting, a family ministry built on faith, love, and unity. But inside the walls of the ministry, things were far from perfect. Marcus had always been the driving force behind Daystar, the voice that guided everything the network did. His vision had shaped the ministry, and for years the Lamb family had worked together to bring that vision to life. When Marcus passed away, many assumed that his son Jonathan Lamb would naturally step into the leadership role. After all, Jonathan had been by his father's side for years, learning the ropes, preparing for the day when he would carry the torch forward. But Joni Lamb, Marcus's widow, had other plans. At first, no one questioned her taking the reins. She had been there from the start, helping Marcus build Daystar from the ground up. It made sense that she would step in temporarily, just until the family could figure out the next steps. However, as time went on, it became clear that Joni wasn't planning on stepping aside anytime soon. Slowly but surely, she began to take more control of the network, making decisions without consulting Jonathan. His role in the ministry began to shrink, and Joni's presence grew larger. The tension between them became palpable. Jonathan felt increasingly sidelined and pushed out of the very ministry his father had built. For him, it wasn't just about leadership, it was about the legacy of Daystar. To Jonathan, it felt like his father's vision was being rewritten. Daystar had always been a family ministry, but now it seemed to be moving in a direction that he didn't recognize. Joni's decision to marry Dr. Doug Weiss, a well-known Christian counselor, further complicated things. Doug's influence began to permeate Daystar, and for some, his presence felt like an intrusion. To others, he was a stabilizing force who could help Joni navigate the transition. But to Jonathan, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of the family ministry his father had created. As the months went by, the divide between mother and son grew wider. Jonathan began speaking out, questioning the direction Daystar was taking. He accused Joni of turning the ministry into something about control and image, rather than faith and service. For Joni, it was a painful but necessary decision to take control. She believed she was doing what Marcus would have wanted, preserving the ministry that he had spent his life building. But to many, it looked like a power struggle, a battle for the soul of Daystar. The breaking point came when Jonathan was officially removed from his leadership position. Joni cited performance issues and his refusal to follow a performance improvement plan. But to many, it felt like a personal decision. Jonathan's supporters rallied behind him, accusing Joni of betraying the family's legacy. Meanwhile, Joni defended her actions, claiming she was only doing what needed to be done to protect Daystar's future. The impact of this internal battle was felt across the ministry. Staff members, once united in their mission, found themselves caught in the middle. Some stayed loyal to Joni, while others quietly supported Jonathan. The atmosphere at Daystar shifted from one of collaboration and unity to one of fear and distrust. The programming began to reflect these changes as well. What had once been a network that celebrated diverse ministries and voices became more focused on Joni and her message. Daystar's viewers, who had trusted the network for years, began to notice the shift. The warmth and authenticity that had defined Daystar seemed to be fading. In its place was a polished, controlled image that felt more like a corporate entity than a family ministry. Questions began to surface. Was this still the Daystar they had known and loved, or had it become something else entirely? The battle for Daystar's legacy was no longer just about family or leadership. It was about the future of the ministry itself. Joni remained determined, working tirelessly to reassure the public that Daystar's mission had not changed. But behind the scenes, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. As the ministry struggled to rebuild trust, many wondered if Daystar could ever return to what it once was. The battle for Daystar's future was still ongoing, and its outcome remained uncertain.